Welcome, everybody. I'll just click on to the agenda. So today we've got quite a lot to run through. I'll start by giving a quick overview of ATMA. And then we're just going to cover very quickly some of the jargon around ESG and sustainability. Now, I won't dwell on this because Holly did a great job in the last webinar. And if you do want to go into a bit more depth in terms of the kind of fundamentals of ESG and sustainability, I do encourage you to check out the first webinar that we did on ESG that Holly did a couple of weeks ago. So for members, that's available in the resource section. Otherwise, you can reach out to us and we can share that with you. Then we'll go into the meat of the presentation and we'll talk about the role of global mobility within ESG and sustainability. We'll take a look at a carbon footprint of a relocation. We'll look at the ESG of global mobility. So we'll go through each element of that and how mobility impacts the different parts of ESG. And then we'll look at a green move policy and what that might look like, encompassing elements of ESG. And then we'll look at some action steps that you can take away either for your program or with your clients. And then Stephen will give us an update on Schneider Electric on their journey following their kind of ESG and mobility strategy. Okay. So, okay, we have a few more people join now, so let's crack on. So just very quickly then, ATMA, Asia Talent Mobility Alliance, we are a not-for-profit organization supporting and driving innovation within the global mobility industry in Asia. We have 4 key pillars of the organization. The first pillar is ESG and sustainability, which of course is what we're focusing on today. We have an advocacy pillar, an education and development pillar, and one of the flagship programs we have under that is our mentorship program. So if you are keen to partake in that mentorship program, please reach out to us. We have an amazing slate of mentors that have joined the program. So we've already kicked off the first cohort of mentors and mentees, which is already in its 3rd or 4th month. But we are opening it for further mentees now. So if you're interested, please reach out. It's a part of the membership of ATMA, so there's no cost, although you do need to be a member to join the program. And the final pillar is event and networking. So look out for future events that we'll be planning across the region. We've already had a number of events in Singapore, India, and we'll be planning other events in other parts of Asia as well. Okay. So what are we trying to achieve in terms of ATMA and our ESG pillar? So we're really looking to enhance the innovation and development of ESG within our industry in Asia. And we're going to do that by supporting our members in integrating sustainable practices and values into their operations across Asia. And to do that, we're looking to create long-term value for our members and stakeholders in terms of the full spectrum of ESG, so environmental impacts, social responsibility, and strong governance practices. Okay. And embracing transparency, ethical conduct, inclusive engagement, and innovation to positively contribute to society and the environment. Okay, so we are member-driven. So I encourage you to get involved. We're going to talk throughout this presentation about the importance of sustainability and the increasing importance that will creep into our industry. So now is as good a time as any to educate yourself and get involved in this, in this part of our industry. So as part of the ESG committee, there's myself, Stephen Park, who runs mobility in APAC for Schneider Electric, and Stephen will be talking to us later about the latest kind of updates from their ESG program within mobility, and Holly Naylor from Relay Network Asia. So Holly is the Sustainability Officer at RNA, and you would have seen her conduct the last webinar where she went into the fundamentals of ESG. And Holly is responsible for a lot of our blogs and educational content. So like I said, we're member driven, and if anybody has a passion around ESG and wishes to join our committee and help us drive some of these programs, then please reach out. We're always looking for more members. I mean, it's all volunteer driven, so the more people that get involved, the more that we can achieve. Okay. So I'm just going to cover very briefly some of the fundamentals. I won't go into detail because Holly covered this in her webinar recently. But sustainability is often defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. And typically there's three main pillars of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social, which is often referred to as the three Ps: people, planet, and profitability. And to gain true sustainability, you need alignment in all three. Okay. And if we look at ESG, I think everyone's familiar with that term now. So environmental, social, and governance. And you can see some of the different elements that fall under each of those three buckets. But ESG reporting has become pretty much standard throughout the world now. Most multinationals will have a requirement to report on their ESG. This is often mandated by governments in many parts of the world, or it's being slated within the next couple of years. And typically it's based on an organization's support of the 17 UN SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals. And increasingly it's aligned to different global reporting initiatives, such as the GRI, or in APAC, we see the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. Okay. And some of these requirements, as I mentioned, are already mandated, such as in the European Union, and will be mandated in APAC coming up. So it's certainly the time now to be familiar with these terms, the reporting requirements, and what we can do in global mobility to play an active part. And many large multinationals set their greenhouse gas emission targets according to SBTI, so Science-Based Targets initiatives. Many companies have a commitment to reach net zero by 2050, but some of the more pioneering companies are setting those net zero targets to 2030. So you'll see a lot more activity as we reach those key milestones. And of course, with global warming, many companies and governments are placing a huge focus on CO2 and net zero policies. So we will be seeing a lot more regulations around that. Okay, these are the 17 SDGs. So you can see some of these have a clear connection to global mobility. If you look at things like decent work and economic growth, gender equality, some of them may have an indirect relationship with mobility, especially around the kind of climate action and things like that. But if you're working for a service provider, of course, then much more of these will come into play in terms of consumption of energy and water, human rights, and so on. Okay. So if we look at a sample ESG guide, and this is from NASDAQ, you can see some of the criteria that's listed out under each of the ESG buckets. And what I've done there is I've just indicated which one of these have a direct impact on global mobility. So you can see under the environmental, the big focus is on greenhouse gas emissions. Typically, we talk about CO2, but of course, there's other greenhouse gases as well, such as sulfur, nitrogen, and so on, and also environmental operations. But of course, if you're a service provider working in our industry, then other elements of this will come into play as well as you report on your ESG metrics, such as your energy usage, water usage, climate risk mitigation, and so on. Under the social side, the things that may impact within mobility: gender pay ratio, employee turnover, gender diversity, non-discrimination, global health and safety. So we all create policies that support or look at these elements. And on the governance side, there's a lot there that we've been doing for years, but there's a lot more focus now in terms of incentivized pay, supplier code of conduct, ethics, and anti-corruption. So as we move people across borders, especially executives, then we need to make sure that employees understand the governance aspect to being able to serve on their boards and senior positions within companies. So this all plays a part and also can be supported by global mobility as companies are moving senior executives around the world. And when we talk about greenhouse gases, of course, there's three different scopes. So scope 1 is direct emissions that you have direct control over. This is typically for manufacturing companies that might use fossil fuels in terms of their manufacturing process or company vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from energy. So the energy, electricity, and so on that you purchase, that will have a greenhouse gas emission depending on the type of energy, whether it's renewable or coal or so on. And then scope 3 is pretty much everything else, all other indirect emissions. So this may be with your supply chain, purchased services or materials, business trips. And this is typically where relocation will fall under, business trips, relocations. Now, a key point to note here is that most companies are focusing on scope 1 and 2 currently, and a lot of the reporting requirements around scope 1 and 2. But increasingly, companies and governments are starting to dictate reporting of scope 3 as well. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So although scope 3 may not be the main focus in the next few years, it certainly will be. So it's certainly a good time to start looking at your own internal processes and data and start building up the capabilities to report and offset the carbon throughout all three scopes. Now, if you're a service provider, of course, scope 2, you'd be looking at your energy bills, and there's plenty of carbon calculators that you could use to calculate the carbon footprint of your energy usage. And you could go back several years and set a benchmark, say 2023, and then set targets based on that. Okay, so there's a lot of resources, information out there that you can start your journey and just start making some simple kind of ESG related targets and reporting requirements. Now, carbon offsets is a big part of the equation. So obviously the intent is to reduce carbon, but you won't be able to reduce everything. So what carbon is emitted, the idea to reach net zero is to offset that carbon. And this is done through carbon offsets, which is basically investments in emission reduction projects, typically in developing countries. And that could be tree planting, and there's lots of reporting in data around the efficiency of that. Or it could be renewable projects, carbon capture projects. And then once you've invested in those, you get a certificate to prove your carbon offset. Now, the current kind of market price of a carbon offset or a metric ton of CO2, it varies greatly depending on the country and the market, but Bloomberg have estimated the average is around $13 per metric ton. And right now there's an oversupply of carbon kind of credits, carbon offsets. But as we start reaching some of those key milestones, so 2030 and 2050, you'll see the demand increasing. So Bloomberg, in a recent report, expect the carbon offset price or the metric ton of carbon to reach $20 per ton in 2030, but peaking at around $243 in 2046 when the market becomes undersupplied. So you can see right now carbon offsets are pretty affordable, but certainly preparing for that price rise and reducing your carbon will make a lot of sense, not only for the environment, but financially for the bottom line as companies aim to reach carbon net neutrality. And just as an FYI, airlines are currently charging between $10 to $12 per metric ton to offset the carbon of flights. Okay, so that gives you a pretty good idea of where it's at right now. Now, as I mentioned, some companies have already made commitments around all three scopes. So you can see the founding partners of Transform to Net Zero, which is a movement of some very large organizations that have committed to reaching net zero across the full supply chain by 2030. So you can see some big names there. So if you're servicing or working for any of these companies, by 2030, you're going to need to be net neutral. So you can expect certainly a lot of focus around reporting and offsetting over the next few years. And this is just a small sample of companies. There will be a lot more that will be making these commitments. So it may not be happening too much right now, but it's definitely on the horizon. So certainly a time to focus on this and get your planning in place. And even in APAC, the ISSB reporting requirements are, intensifying across the region. Recently, Singapore announced that listed companies will have to start reporting their sustainability information from 2025. That's across scope 1 and 2, and scope 3 from 2026. And large non-listed firms will follow 2 years after that. So that means if you're a service provider and you're working for a Singapore listed company, you're going to have to start reporting on your scope 3, so your relocation activities, by 2026. So it makes sense to start reaching out to these companies and start having a dialogue around what information they require, and get your systems and your reporting capabilities in order. And this is just Singapore, but you'll find that in Hong Kong, in other countries across Asia Pacific are also following suit, starting. Some have already started, some are starting in 25 and 2026. So it's certainly coming. Okay, so now let's dig in a bit deeper into the role of global mobility within the ESG space. So an interesting kind of data point from the recent Mobility Reimagined survey by EY. So 77% of respondents reported an organization-wide ESG strategy, which is, to be expected. I would have thought it might have been a bit higher than that. But only 35% have actively engaged global mobility in focusing on ESG in the program. And I would say, a significantly smaller number have actually put in place robust kind of policies and programs to support the ESG strategy. I mean, we'll hear later from Schneider Electric, but they're one of the pioneering companies that are kind of driving this. I think across the industry, it's still, people are very much at the beginning, kind of early stages of their journey. So what we can do from an industry to support them is going to be really helpful. So some of the considerations, if you're thinking about sustainable mobility. So in the recent couple of years, virtual assignments have become popular. So, is it worth considering if a relocation event is actually necessary? Although you would have to look at the frequent business travel of a virtual role and see if that offsets any carbon savings of not relocating a family. Regional or local talent. So has a local talent pool, both internal and external, been explored to find the right talent? Obviously, it's a lot more sustainable to source talent locally or within the region than it is to import talent from further afield. And is the role accessible and supported across diverse talent populations? So, companies that kind of look at the different talent populations, making sure that roles are available across the whole kind of talent pool, and supporting those different talent populations are going to be a lot more sustainable in terms of their workforce planning. And is the right duty of care and support provided, especially within our global mobility sphere? We're moving people and families across borders. Also, governance of all the compliance regulations being met in terms of right to work, local labor testing, posted worker, etc. Within our industry, governance is a huge part of what we do. And culture as well. So has the right cultural training and support been provided to enable that executive or that employee to be successful and compliant, and culturally sensitive in their new role? Equity. So within mobility, we can look at compensation across the mobility program, across gender, race, etc. And is there a fair representation? And are we supporting social development? So looking at displaced talent, remote talent in less developed locations where we can support local communities in instead of moving talent to a location, say in Singapore or elsewhere, can we build a development team on site, say in India or Vietnam or Indonesia, where the talent sits, and support that local community? Okay, so a lot of these considerations are already kind of a part of global mobility managers kind of consulting, in the past few years, but some of them might have come to the fore in the last year or two. So if we look at a model now of a carbon footprint of a typical relocation, so this is not extensive. I've just selected a number of parameters. I haven't looked at, for example, internal transportation for a household goods shipment. But what I've done is I've selected key elements and used readily available resources and carbon calculators to calculate the carbon footprint. So you can see here on the left a typical relocation with your standard kind of relocation elements that are often provided. And you can see the carbon footprint kind of score there in kilograms and tons. Okay. And on the right side, what I've done is I just offered maybe a more greener alternative, and you can see the difference in the carbon footprint. Okay, so making slight tweaks to a program can have quite a significant impact on the carbon footprint. So you can see on the alternative on the right, you're making a 74% reduction in your carbon footprint, and potentially not making a significant impact in the employee experience. Okay. And if we look at that in a graphical kind of form, you can see the big ticket items are things like flights, look-see trip, which of course involves flights as well, a sea shipment and air shipment. And if you look at some of the other elements like orientation, home finding, these are very minimal. So I think to make the biggest impact, you need to focus on your kind of big ticket items, which are the flights, in reducing your carbon footprint. So it could be kind of, instead of a separate look-see travel flight, maybe combining it with a business trip or a virtual look-see, instead of business class flights, economy class flights. So there are ways to kind of make quick wins in terms of reducing your carbon footprint. And just as an interesting kind of comparison to what we saw earlier in the carbon offset cost. So right now, this typical relocation to offset the carbon would cost $522. By 2030, that would go up to $803 US. But by 2046, that would be $9,700. Okay, so if you're adding the carbon offset cost into the kind of cost estimate for a relocation, which companies will have to do in the next few years, then you can see, the potential cost of the program with a typical relocation. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the different elements of E, S, and G. So the first one, environmental. So how can we reduce greenhouse gases within our industry? So as I mentioned, a virtual DSP, so digital look-see trips, that would remove the necessity for flights. So where appropriate, that can be introduced into the program. Virtual household goods surveys, so in locations where driving an hour through traffic to get to a survey can be offset by doing a virtual survey. Discard and donate has been in place for many years now, and is an effective way to reduce household goods shipments. Removing the air shipment, potentially providing an allowance instead, can remove quite a bit of carbon from the program. And looking at the transport benefits, so restricting to low emission or electric vehicles can have a significant impact, or providing instead a public transport allowance where appropriate, or even carpooling in some locations. This can be an effective tool. And also setting carbon limits within your program. So incentivizing employees to reduce greenhouse gases. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail later, but potentially increasing a relay allowance or cash as an offset to reducing some of these kind of carbon intensive relocation benefits. And then choosing vendors with green credentials. across the supply chain. There's been several companies within our industry that have gained EcoVadis certification. Relay Network Asia is one of them. So this is a great indication of, a company that's, serious about their kind of sustainability credentials and are on a path to kind of reporting and reducing their carbon footprints and other sustainability kind of elements as well. Carbon offsets, so offsetting the carbon that is actually emitted, and then looking at the environmental operations, sustainable materials, kind of looking at circularity and energy use as well. On the social side, and we will go into future webinars, we'll look in more detail into the different kind of elements of social as well as governance. But just today, we'll look at high level. So the first kind of thing to think about is, are you reporting the right workforce data? Because without that, it's going to be very difficult to look at any of the kind of following points here in terms of your policies and supporting the social aspect of ESG. Revamping policies to support diverse talent populations and communicating support for diverse groups. So, trying to engage all the different talent populations within your organization to make sure that mobility opportunities are accessible to all. Providing the intercultural training, partner support, EAP programs for mobile talent, so that duty of care. Employee turnover is one of the social aspects of an ESG report, so assignee retention plays into that. And also providing employee development opportunities, and that could be rotations, virtual assignments, so increasing those job opportunities for different populations. So that could be, in developing countries, younger talent, talent from different diverse groups. So there's ways that mobility can play into that to support these different groups and provide the developmental opportunities to help them in their career. Mobility in the past few years has refocused on internal mobility. So a number of companies have moved that aspect into the global mobility function. So an open talent marketplace, so encouraging employees across the world to have access to opportunities globally. This is something that Stephen, is talked about within Schneider. And within the talent acquisition, so, working with talent acquisition to ensure that diverse talent pools and inclusive hiring across, different diverse groups, and also, displaced talent populations that are supported by companies like organizations like Talent Beyond Boundaries, for example. And engaging employee resource groups will be an essential part of, the social aspect of ESG. So understanding the barriers and challenges of international assignments across these different groups and creating support networks and making these different groups feel like they're supported and have the right kind of support in place to take on these assignments. And then communicating your DE&I goals across the supply chain and assessing within your vendor selection. So making sure your vendors are aware of your DE&I goals so they can also help support your program as well. And on the governance side, this is a key part of mobility anyway, but incentives linked to ESG targets for mobile executives, ethics training, so anti-bribery, corruption for people in cross-border roles, unconscious bias training, kind of combined with intercultural training. So leadership has coaching across intercultural awareness so that they can remove any unconscious bias. And also within the supply chain, so ESG metrics built into the procurement process, and SLAs, and of course, compliance and equity. Okay. So if we think about a green move policy, so this is something that can, be developed within a mobility program. So the first point, of course, would be education. So providing CO2 data to employees so that it will help drive them make more sustainable decisions in their kind of behaviors and selection of benefits. And introducing some of the kind of green move type services, so virtual destination services, reducing household goods, so removing the air shipment, discard and donate, looking at furnished housing instead of shipping goods. But you'd also have to kind of consider what the impact of that is in terms of storage in the home country. Providing a public transport allowance instead of a car, where that's appropriate. So places like Singapore, Hong Kong, which has strong public transport networks, that could be a workable kind of alternative. And removing utility support. So driving different behaviors. So if an employee is paying for their own electricity, then that will encourage more sustainable behavior rather than the company paying for 24-hour aircon. And sustainability focused orientation. We'll look at that in the next slide, but also providing employee incentives to take more sustainable decisions, maybe gamify the process, convert it into a cash kind of alternative, or if they reach certain carbon reduction targets, then there could be some benefits kind of shifted into other areas. And then, of course, offsetting the carbon that cannot be reduced so that you reach that net zero. Okay. And in terms of a sustainable orientation, so once you're moving somebody to a new location, how can we best set them up to live more sustainably in the new location? So looking at your providers, ensure they have green credentials. We mentioned EcoVadis is a great certification tool, and making sure that your providers can provide location-specific sustainability information. So an overview of the public transport network, looking at options to commute and tying that into school and housing selection, understanding the energy efficiency of properties, an overview of local recycling and upcycling options, an overview of green energy providers using renewable sources, and introduction to sustainable businesses, so buy local food markets, etc. Introduction to local community and volunteer projects, and connecting them to resource groups. A lot of expats, when they go to a new location, they're keen to kind of give back and support the local communities. And information on secondhand marketplaces, discard and donate. So instead of buying brand new, then there's plenty of options to buy secondhand. And of course, the use of hybrid and electric vehicles where it kind of is appropriate. Okay, so just some ideas there around the support you can provide to your transferees and assignees in terms of living more sustainably in a new location. So just to finish off my piece, so some action steps. So I think the first part is to review your company's ESG and sustainability report to see how you can kind of collaborate with that and play a part. Identify the key sustainability stakeholders within your organization and start opening a conversation. Okay, let them know what you do and how, who you are and how you can potentially support their ESG strategy. And then tracking and measuring. So identifying metrics that can be measured and reported. And you can then start identifying trends and setting KPIs around some of the ESG kind of criteria that we identified earlier. It's always a good idea to have a sustainability champion to lead these efforts. So there's someone accountable for driving the kind of development of the program. And then you can develop a roadmap and communicate a mobility ESG strategy, set your metrics, short and long-term kind of goals and performance targets. It's good to have some quick wins, some easy kind of policy interventions that can make a significant impact. And then you can also review existing policies, develop a green move policy like we discussed, potentially have a traffic light system, so an easy way for employees to kind of identify, okay, these are the more carbon intensive kind of benefits, and these are the more sustainable alternatives. And again, identifying quick wins. Okay, so that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to Stephen. I just want to check if we have any questions. Okay, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A chat, and we can address those before the end of the session. But Stephen, I'll hand it over to you now.
Great. Thanks for that, Sean. Wonderful presentation. It really has given us a quick overview on the topics, and in a relatively succinct and easy to understand way as well. I see a few familiar names in the participants list, so thank you very much for your time. Um, Sustainability at Schneider Electric is something we have been looking at over the last couple of years. So, sustainability is a very important part of our mindset and culture. What we want to do is make an impact on the planet, and our business is really around automation, energy management, and sustainability consulting. So you can see why we've picked up on this topic to really try and do a deep dive as to where do we start, how do we operationally look at this as well. It did stem from the time of COVID, where we did see a lot of numbers go down, or we expected numbers to go down during COVID. However, the reality for us was 2020 when COVID hit. It was relatively small, the impact. We saw our numbers go down 5% maybe, which meant that originally we thought that the volumes were going to go significantly down, but in reality, it only dipped slightly. But what we experienced straight after that is the rebound from COVID, plus more mobility than anticipated due to world events. And that's where we got thinking, if our numbers grow, because mobility seems to be correlated to our business growth, and we've got pretty ambitious targets as a business, then surely our mobility will grow in tandem with business growth as well. And that's where we thought, okay, if we have more mobility, then that in hand means more carbon offsets. Do we need to have a look at this? Because ultimately, if we, in say 5-10 years time, double our mobility numbers, then that's double our carbon footprint as well. So that's where we took a step back and just thought, okay, where do we start? I don't think other organizations have gone down the path this quickly. We were also not wanting to go down too quickly as well. We wanted to really just understand how this all works and what our position is as well. What's the real reason we want to look at this? What's our mission statement? How does it tie in with the organization's sustainability targets? So that's where we started coming up with a blueprint around what we wanted to do. If we look at some of the feedback coming through the Carter's Global Talent Mobility Survey results as well, they recently issued one just a few weeks ago. Their survey shows that 7 out of 10 HR leaders expect mobility volumes to either increase or stay the same volumes over the last 2 years. So that kind of indicates to me that we were on the right path. Our Schneider mobility numbers were going up. Publicly available information is we are expecting by 2027 to be a 50 billion euro company, which means over the next 4 years, we need to grow 10% revenues over that time, which also then might mean because we're supplying manpower to markets where there's a talent shortage, then our mobility numbers will correspondingly grow by 10% as well. What's really encouraging for me in this forum is that there is a lot of interest on this topic. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to listen to Sean and myself. But what we're seeing is over the last year or two that the amount of interest has also grown, and the interest is coming from all directions, from either procurement, asking the vendors to really come up with ways to address this from a procurement perspective, also from internally from our, say, sustainability officers who are looking at this topic, maybe not with the mobility lens, but maybe at the corporate lens, at the global lens. Sean talked about the United Nations targets as well. We've also at Schneider looked at that, and we've broadly looked at it across 6 different categories, but within the 6 categories, such as climate, equity, we also have 25 specific targets that we want to measure and actually hold ourselves accountable for over the next 5 to 10 years. And if you look at our public information on the website, we're very vocal about where we want to be. We've got targets for 2025, we've got targets for 2030, and also targets for 2050 as well. And that's also tied in with what we're telling our stakeholders, such as shareholders, publicly where we want to be around this as well. So we'll go on to the next slide, Sean. Thank you. I'll talk about how we've got here. So if you've been through some of our sessions before, I'll touch onto some of, I'll give you a quick catch up as to where we are. So in terms of the sustainability topics, Schneider, as I mentioned, we've got our own targets around what we want to do on this topic. That's where we've, as a mobility function, have identified those targets and thought, okay, which one of those can we influence? The topics are quite varied, and I think where we've landed for our kind of focus is really around CO2 emissions. Items such as equity or other areas, we could influence them. We've got maybe other work streams around it, like diversity. However, we thought for our kind of specific target over the next year or two is to really focus on the CO2 emissions. It's quite a challenge, but we thought that's how best we can contribute towards Schneider's sustainability essential goals, which are those 25 targets I mentioned before. Sean's gone through kind of a very rough idea of what a calculator would look like. We're also going through that exercise as well. Luckily, with our sustainability business here, we actually do quite a bit of consulting work around this. There are some existing calculators out there in the market, but what we're trying to do is come up with something that's specific to the mobility industry. There is an element of estimations looking at different technology platforms. However, this is where we want to actually measure ourselves, what we call ourselves the Global International Mobility Centre. What is our carbon emissions, and how do we then come up with some KPIs around that? Once we understand the data, then we want to look at our policies, and I think Sean had some very good examples of some green move policies, policy changes or enhancements. What we'd like to do is, once we have the data, is to then predict with changes to the policy how much more we can reduce carbon emissions, or hopefully reduce is the word. I think that's where, if we play around with the policies, how far can we push them before it impacts other areas such as assignee experience. So with that on the right side, this is our footpath over the next couple of years, hopefully over the next 2 years, to really quickly make some changes around it. So we've connected with our sustainability team. They're experts around greenhouse gas counting, ESG advisory, and all these wonderful topics. From a mobility perspective, we might not be the subject matter experts, so we're really looking at our internal stakeholders to give us some accelerated learnings and some tools around it as well. Then we've also looked at our procurement team, who are working closely with our vendors to then come up with a strategy around it. I'll go on to the next slide, Sean, and I'll really go through what our path does look like. So this is where, at the beginning of this year, we engaged our stakeholders, and our sustainability team have basically said, this is how we would like you to see the path going forward. So number one, you've really got to measure the impact. For us, that's all about data collection, educating the stakeholders, saying, hey, we're international mobility, we have this path that we want to go down along this sustainability journey. What kind of feedback do you have? Where do you see us coming into to make an impact as well? With that, once we understand what the data looks like, then we can maybe say, okay, if our mobility numbers increase by 10% each year, then should we be okay to say our carbon emissions increase relatively low at say 5% or 2% or zero, once we understand what is realistic, then we can start looking at our targets and go, okay, with our policy changes, how do we impact that as well? So that would take us to designing the implementation program further down the road. Ultimately, where we want to be is in 5 years' time, see that our data shows that we've actually met our targets and our target has been achieved, and also if there's any room for improvement going forward as well. It's quite an ambitious target, I feel. However, it is a journey that we are pleased to go through, and if anything, once we embark on this, we would like to share as much knowledge as possible. One thing through all these discussions that really pricked up my interest was with our assignee experience. We measure our assignee experience where people rate us based on whether we have whether they're satisfied with the assignee process. We have been getting quite good scores lately. That's something that we've been focusing on. However, I had that big question: would our assignee feedback differ based on gender? And if we had a big difference there, then maybe our mobility policies have a gender bias. I'm happy to know that after looking at all the data, the difference, there was a difference. However, it was relatively negligible, which meant our policies were okay to start with. I think there is always room for improvement, but that's one where you just need the data to be able to come up with a conclusion. So that was just one example of where we're trying to collect as much data as possible from different sources. This is not necessarily about CO2 emissions, but it's about gender and how our policy impacts the delivery, but based on gender feedback. Great. I'll move on to the next slide. Thanks, Sean. Okay, so if you look at this one, we've kind of broken down phase one, which is really at the beginning of that roadmap. It's about measuring impact. You can see even within that phase, there's quite a lot of different elements that we wanted to go down. I think when I first spoke about this a few months ago, we were at the kickoff stage. I'm happy to note that we're in between the data collection stage and the emissions calculation stage at this point in time. What we've done is we've kind of come up with a mission statement. We've gone with our bold ambition, documented that, and then with that we went to our relevant stakeholders to kind of figure out what is the lay of the land. We really didn't want to duplicate work, so engaging the stakeholders helped us then formulate our plan of attack. Once we had the plan of attack, we then wanted to go through the data collection process, and that was pretty tricky for us because no one had ever done that before. We had to engage with our vendors to see what kind of data they had historically. So we looked at 2023 as our baseline, and what we wanted to do was collect as much information from our vendors as possible to then come up with almost a massive spreadsheet of items such as policy type. Were they permanent transfer? Were they short-term assignment, long-term assignment? Then with that, we wanted to look at the home city, the host city, family size, how the shipment was relocated across borders. Was it by sea shipment, air shipment, road shipment? So you can imagine that at the design phase with the data collection, it did take a bit of time to really come down with a template to pass on to our vendors. With the vendors we're working with, they were very, let's say, proactive in terms of saying, this is a challenge. We'll try and generate reports which match your request for the data collection. It has taken a few weeks for them to come back. However, I'm happy to note that over the next week or two, we should be receiving all of our data requests back. And then that's where we're going into the next phase, which is using that data. We ask for the raw data, nothing that was kind of processed in any form. And then with the raw data, we're collecting that with all our different vendors to come up with a way to calculate the emissions. So hopefully over the next week or two, we'll be at the fourth stage there, which is calculating the emissions. We have we have a wonderful intern who's joined us over the summer break who will be helping us with that. So we're on the way for that. Once we have the emissions calculated, then we'll go into the next stage over probably in about 2 or 3 months' time, just to really look at the data and go, okay, is it what we expected? How could we influence it as well? So around that time, I think we'll keep going down this journey, and we'll have a few more items to share in the next coming weeks as well. One thing to note here as well, on Friday this week, we've decided to have a workshop on the Schneider premises. We've invited certain organizations which have identified sustainability as being a key topic for them. Just letting this audience know that there are 3 spots available. If anyone on Friday morning, it's a Friday afternoon, has time available and this is a key priority for you, then you're more than welcome to contact myself or Sean to see whether you can come and meet us face to face and talk about some of these initiatives. I'll be going through developing a business case around it, and then looking at, okay, what challenges did we at Schneider experience with the data collection phase as well. So if anyone's interested, please reach out. So that's all I've got as an update from Schneider. Sean, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And like Stephen mentioned, we've got the workshop coming up on Friday, which will be, I think it's an industry first where we're having a full engaged workshop to help organizations build that business case to start that journey. So, if this is for corporate HR running mobility programs, so if you or anybody within your network is keen, we do have 3 spots left. So a great initiative from Schneider Electric and sponsored through ATMA. So yeah, please let us know if anybody is interested there. So we've come to the end of the presentation. So maybe we've got a minute or 2 for any questions. So if there are any questions, please let us know. You can pop them in the Q&A box. I don't think we have any so far, but it's a great opportunity to ask Stephen or myself if you have any questions. While we wait for those, just again to reiterate that, within ATMA, we are a member-driven organization, so we do rely on people to join as a member, get involved, play a part in our different committees. We have an education committee, we have different subcommittees and groups that are driving different projects within our industry. And of course, the ESG committee that myself, Stephen, and Holly are part of, we're always looking for additional members that are passionate and kind of willing to help us drive this initiative and help kind of elevate our industry, especially in APAC, in terms of their kind of ESG journey. Just quickly, we will have a series of other webinars coming up. We'll go into a little more detail in terms of the social side of ESG. We're looking to kind of DE&I programs. We'll also plan a webinar going into more depth around the governance aspects. I mean, today we focus quite a bit on the environmental. And then we'll also look at other kind of topics within ESG as well, around greenwashing, reporting, and we'll be bringing in guest speakers as well. So please keep an eye on upcoming events. We'll have other kind of in-person events as well. So if you're not a member, join up, and just keep an eye on what's coming up. So I don't think we have any questions, but feel free to reach out to myself or Stephen after this. Our contact details are there. If you have any questions or want to discuss or you want to participate in the committee, feel free to reach out. We're always available to help or respond to any questions you have. Otherwise, I think we will close it there. And thank you everyone for joining. We will post a recording of this. And all these resources will be available on the ATMA website for members as well. So yeah, thanks again and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone.